Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man ihtada bihudah, amma ba'd. Jazakallah khair once again, siblings of ilm, for providing us with this wonderful opportunity. And without further ado, I think we should just begin. This webinar, inshallah, is only an introduction. So please don't expect to become, the next Mutanabbi just from the next hour or so. We'll take this easy, inshallah. We'll take this quite slowly. I've tried to simplify a lot of the content, both beginners and advanced, in an easy way as possible. There are those of you who have tried to access traditional or classical works on the topic. You might have noticed that a lot of it is, sometimes it can get inaccessible for those of us who are, 1400 years away from the tradition. And so as such, what I've tried to do is, for the sake of this webinar, we're not going to go into all of the jargon. We're not going to go into all of the technical terms, which is going to go straight into the foundations and the usul of the field. And inshallah, once somebody has gained the foundations in there, then they may take a more advanced course, or they can go into the rules pertaining to, the sub-rules of the rules that we cover, and perhaps even self-study some advanced books, inshallah. So by the end of this particular webinar, the aim is for everybody, inshallah, to at least be able to recognize what is poetry and what is prose. So this should be fairly easy. We'll be covering that right from the start, inshallah. So what is poetry and what is not poetry? What is creative writing and things like that? At a more advanced level, we would want to be able to appreciate the mechanisms behind poetry in order to read and compose poetry correctly. So some people might want to just, once you're reading an Arabic book and some abiyat come up, you want to be able to recite that properly. Or others might be aspiring Nashīd artists or aspiring poets, and you might want to, this is probably your first step into wanting to compose properly. So inshallah, this will give enough of the foundations to do this. And of course, we want to recognize when poetry and Nashīds are recited correctly. And we'll towards the end of the webinar, inshallah, we'll be exploring one quite a popular Nashīd, inshallah, wherein a performer actually makes one or two errors, and we'll explore that in a bit more detail later on, inshallah. So I've split this into 4 parts. So one is just introduction. The most dense bit will probably be section 2. So 2 and 3, 3 is a bit lighter. Section 2 and 3 is where the theory begins, or where all the theory is. And section 4, inshallah, will apply everything we've covered. And inshallah, once everything is applied, then we will end the webinar with a Q&A bi'idhnillah. So meters and poetry, poetic meters is also called verse or prosody. So these are just terms you might want to be familiar with. Again, there's a lot of words or terms that we find in a lot of places. We don't need to bother about these at an introductory level. So don't let anything overwhelm you. There is a section where I've got, especially in the English one, when we're covering the English section in in part 3, where I've included all of the jargon just for your own references. So you don't need to learn any of that, because realistically, there's no point. But for example, if somebody is interested in literature and want to take it further, or you're probably a school teacher, then all the words and the technical terms are there for you. So now, why learn poetic meters? Why learn ʿIlm al-ʿArūḍ in Arabic? For what reasons might somebody want to learn these? Now, of course, there are plenty of reasons why somebody might want to learn this. Sometimes because you just want to appreciate poetry. Maybe somebody wants to become an aspiring, or is aspiring to become a poet or a Nashīd artist or a spoken word artist, or something along those lines. However, one of the more noble intentions for learning ʿIlm al-ʿArūḍ, more specifically, is to appreciate why or how the Qur'an is not poetry, and how the Prophet ﷺ was not a poet. This, of course, is something only Muslims would be concerned with. So, of course, every Muslim knows and believes that the Qur'an is not poetry. However, a lot of people might have this as a blind faith or a taqlidi position. So, inshallah, after this, we'll be able to take our faith in this particular concept out of a blind one and in a more informed one with basira, inshallah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an, وَمَا هُوَ بِقَوْلِ شَاعِرٍ قَلِيلًا مَا تُؤْمِنُونَ. And it is not the word of a poet. This Qur'an is not the word of a poet. How little do you believe? In Surah Ya-Sin, you also find وَمَا عَلَّمْنَاهُ شِعْرًا وَمَا يَنْبَغِي لَهُ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا ذِكْرٌ وَقُرْآنٌ مُبِينٌ. That neither have we taught him poetry, meaning we haven't taught the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam poetry, nor is it easy for him, nor is it natural for him. إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا ذِكْرٌ وَقُرْآنٌ مُبِينٌ. It is nothing but a remembrance and a clear recital. So what do these verses mean? Or if you want to appreciate that in a bit more detail, then exploring ʿIlm al-ʿArūḍ would help us appreciate the depth of these verses. So first of all, what is poetry? Now, we're going to go through a definition by al-ʿUnnabi, Abu al-Abbas al-ʿUnnabi, rahimahullah. So he explains, وَالشِّعْرُ الْعَرَبِيُّ قَوْلٌ مُفِيدٌ فَائِدَةً تَامَّةٌ مُعْرَبٌ مَوْزُونٌ بِوَزْنٍ مَعْلُومٍ مُقَفًّى مَقْصُودٌ بِهِ الشِّعْرُ. Every single one of these qualifications actually has a reason behind it, and we're not going to go through everything, inshallah. The summary of this would basically, or however much of that applies in English, would be poetry is meaningful speech. It has to make sense. It's consciously composed in meter and rhyme. It has to be consciously composed. So if something isn't consciously composed, or if it's just accidental, like sometimes you might find a sentence or something on social media, something in a book, or you might have heard something in a lecture, or even in a conversation, and it happens to be in meter, or it happens to rhyme, it doesn't necessarily make it poetry. So it has to be intended as poetry. So if we look here, موزون بوزن معلوم, we'll be covering some of the awzan, or some of the buhur, the meters, later. So there are some things that are not actually in Arabic, or it's not been used by Jahili poetry, and some contemporary writers have produced Nashīds or songs or something, not according to the rules of Arabic poetry, but more in line with the English style in Arabic. So this is an interesting phenomenon, actually, and we'll be covering one example of that, inshallah. If I do forget, then please ask me in the Q&A, because there is an example of this. Now, the point of me saying all this would be that that particular nasheed that you listen to will not be considered shi'r. It won't be poetry, even though it might be a song or a nasheed or something along those lines. Muqaffan here means to have a qafiyah, to have the equivalent of English is probably a rhyme, but it's not actually a rhyme. It's the same letter at the end of all Arabic couplets and poetry. So what we learn here is that poetry is not subjective. It has an objective definition. It is a real thing. It's not something that we can say, oh, poetry can mean different things to different people, as you hear in a lot of modern or postmodern poetry, where we live in a world where things don't have definitions anymore, or we've moved away from the rules, we've moved away from those types of things. So sometimes people might say, why are you learning all this? This is pre-Victorian things. Nowadays, poetry doesn't need to rhyme. Poetry doesn't have to have meter. We'll be covering all of these things, inshallah. So it's not actually hard to define. It has a definition. It has a proper definition. And it's not synonymous with literature. So literature, you can have literature that is not poetry. For example, novels, or any other creative writing, or any other piece of art even. So it's not synonymous with literature. Sometimes people would say, oh, poetry, it's hard to define. It's just really good writing, like literature, which is not the case. You can have bad literature. You can have poetry, so something that fits the technical definition of poetry, but it's just bad. You can have that. So it doesn't have to be, or you can have good literature, really, really good literature, but it doesn't fall under poetry. You can have this. And we'll give examples of everything, inshallah. Sometimes you actually hear people saying, what's the point in learning all of this? All the experts break the rules. So if all the experts break the rules, why should I break the rules? So this is a really interesting one, which is, of course, it's true, in every field, whether it's in Islamic science, whether it's in a worldly science, a secular science, or an art even, everybody will break rules eventually once they reach expertise and they realize that beyond the rules there are a set of meta rules, and we can stick to those. But that's no excuse for somebody to be lazy and not climb the ladder. You have to learn the rules in order to figure out the meta rules, and then you can you can take advantage, take a bit of liberty and break the apparent rules for your own particular reasons. So you could do this in fiqh, for example. If somebody says, oh, all the experts of fiqh, all the experts of Islamic law, they all did ijtihad, so let me go and do it as well. Everybody would say, no, that's not how you do it. You have to start off learning rules, learning concepts, learning furu', learning usul, and then have to spend a bit of time applying everything. And once you can demonstrate your capacity, your acumen and your skill in doing this, then afterwards, yes, you might need to, be able to can do some ijtihad in contemporary issues and things, of course, but you can't just use that as a lazy excuse that all the experts did it, so let me just do it as well. You have to become an expert before you do all of that, of course. So you could say, one example I'd usually give, those of you who have studied mantiq or a bit of logic, is that this would be a category mistake to say all poetry is literature, all literature is poetry. So all poetry, yes, it would be literature, but not all literature would fall under poetry. For example, all apples would be fruits, but not all fruits would be apples. So now we get to what is not poetry. So al-Unnabi carries on, he says, فَإِنْ عَرِيَ عَنْ ذَلِكَ أَوْ بَعْضِهِ فَلَيْسَ بِشِعْرٍ وَلَا يُسَمَّى قَائِلُهُ شَاعِرًا. So if something doesn't have these poetic meters that we've mentioned here, it's not قول مفيد, it's not فائدة تامة, it's not معرب, it's not موزون on a particular meter, it doesn't have قافية, etc., and it's not been intended as poetry, then it won't be poetry, at least in Arabic. And in English, of course, it's the same thing. Any piece of literature is not in rhyming verse, so it's not in meter, it doesn't have beats to it, it doesn't have a flow to it, it doesn't have a rhythm to it, and it doesn't rhyme according to the proper rhyming scales that we have in English, then it wouldn't be poetry. It might be something else, it might be prose. So this is not actually a criticism, this is just calling a spade, putting everything within its correct categories. So it's nothing to be offended by. You'll see a lot of so-called poets on Instagram or Tumblr or Twitter or somewhere, and then they have these fancy little squares with strange sentences organized in a really weird way and calling themselves poets. You don't become a poet that quickly. You can become a poet quickly, but you can't just make it cheap. It's not a cheap art. There is it's a very rich tradition, actually. So, for example, I've given a couple of examples here about why somebody shouldn't be offended about this. It's just a matter of definitions. So let's say football. Football is a very famous sport. So everybody knows that football is a specific sport with its own rules, with a specific type of pitch, with a specific types of nets, 2 teams, 11 people. You'll have a spherical football and you run around, you dribble the ball with your feet. Otherwise, it's just not going to be football. Now, if a group of people decide, okay, no, we're going to change the size of the ball or the shape of the ball, we're not going to run around it with our feet. We're going to have the ball in our hands. We're going to run with that. Yes, okay, fair enough. You have every right to do that, but just realize you've gone beyond the boundaries of football now. Call that a different sport. And this is exactly what happened. This is how rugby came about. Or to give another example, this was a funny anecdote, actually, that happened in our own town. I believe one of the local restaurants had a phone call once with an order, and somebody called up and asked for biryani without rice. And I think, what kind of order is this? How can you have biryani without rice? The definition of a biryani is, rice. It's a rice-based dish, and you're going to have, meat or something else with it. Now, if somebody says, yes, we're going to get rid of the rice, so we're just going to keep the meat or something else, and maybe replace the rice with something else like bread or roti or something, it doesn't become, it's not biryani anymore. Yes, it might be a nice dish. Yes, it might be, we'll call this tharid. And you can even call it a sunnah. You can say, Bismillah, go and have it. But don't call it a biryani anymore, because it's not. It's just as simple as that. So poetry, if it doesn't have a meter, if it doesn't have rhythm and rhyme, so this is why rhythm and rhyme is crucial to poetry. If it doesn't have that, yes, nobody's saying don't do that. You have your creative writing. If you're really creative in producing imagery or depicting imagery, and you have these stylistic devices like alliteration, you can capture people's minds, and you can create a twist in their minds and things. Yeah, go and do all of that, but just do that under a different name of creative writing or prose. Don't do that under poetry unless you can capture everything that you want to say in meter and rhyme. Then Bismillah, call yourself a poet. Now, to get into the key differences of between Arabic and English, we'll start with the Arabic one first. I put on this side, on the right-hand side, because Arabic works right to left. So I don't want to confuse you by doing it the other way. The way Arabic works as a language is it has short vowels and it has long vowels, or it has haraka and it has sakin or sukun. So we have a mutaharrik and we have a sakin, and a combination of those will basically make up the rhythms of a language. So for example, the way I've done it here is one short haraka, one mutaharrik. I've depicted it as a line square, a complete square. And when there's a haraka, a short vowel, along with the sukun afterwards. So like lam. So for example, this one's ara. So there's two short vowels. This would be depicted as two short squares. So two line squares. And where there is something like lam or a mad, you could say. I know it's not technically a mad, but you'll understand what I mean. Any haraka and a sukun afterwards. So lam, or a short or a longer syllable, you could say. This will be depicted as a blue rectangle, which is twice the size of the square. So everything in Arabic could actually be a combination of these. So ala is a short and then a long syllable, or dhahiri is the other way around, where you have a long syllable first, dhah. So haraka, sukun, and then a haraka, dhahiri. Or jabalin, for example, jabalin, you'll have jabalin. So short, long, jabalin. Or samakatan, so samakatan. So this sentence, if you just remember this sentence, you don't have to, but there's a reason. All of these have names actually that you'll find at the beginning of most of these books, but I'm avoiding all of that consciously. I just want to show you the purpose of it. The purpose is you'll see how everything is made up of, and these have other rules that we're not going to cover today. So lam ara ala dhahiri jabalin samakatan. That covers everything, basically. All of these combinations, or every sentence in Arabic would basically be made of a combination of these. Now in English, if you're going to move into English, unlike Arabic, which has a quantitative or length-based style to the language, English doesn't have that. English doesn't have quantity in the language. You do in some places in English, but the way the language works is based on stress or strength. So we could call this accent as well. So for example, let's say the word prevalent. You say prevalent. Prevalent would be correct. You stress on prev and not an alent. So prevalent. Or you say inevitable. You say inevitable. So the stress would be on inevitable. You wouldn't say, for example, instead of prevalent, prevalent. So sometimes you hear people saying, because of prevailing, you think it's prevalent as well. It's not, it's prevalent. So prevalent is right and prevalent is wrong. Or inevitable is right and inevitable is something you hear sometimes as well. Inevitable would be an incorrect pronunciation of the word. So you see how the language actually works based on stress. So this doesn't mean, for example, that Arabic doesn't have stress. Of course, every language has to have stress, because you don't speak in a robotic way. Nobody speaks in a, without any form of emphasis or any form of accent in their speech. But in English, it's a stress-based language, whereas something like Arabic is about the maths behind it. It's a bit more mathematical, and English is a bit more, artistic, you could say. Now, just to give as a fa'idah, as an interesting point, this is a subtlety that you can find in English. It's a really nice one, actually. That every time there's a noun, or not every time, sorry, there are a lot of words where you can use it as a noun and as a verb as well. So when you use it as a noun, then the stress would be right at the beginning of it'd be on the first syllable. So for example, record, you'll have a record of something. This is, somebody has broken the world record, or this is a present that you might give to somebody for Eid, a project that you might be working on, or update, iPhone has the latest update. So you have record, present, project, and update. The moment you turn these into verbs, the stress moves or it shifts into the next syllable. So you say record, or present, project, and update. So you might record a record, or you might present a present, you might project a project, and you might update an update. So this is a very interesting subtlety that we find in the language, through which, inshallah, somebody can appreciate the style of it. Now, of course, Arabic has the same, or it has stresses, And these stresses can differ depending on which country somebody's from. So for example, somebody could say, let's say madrasa. Most Arabs would pronounce it as madrasa, school. And Egyptians, in Egyptian Arabic, they would say madrasa. So the stress would be madrasa, and mainstream Arabs would say madrasa. Another example could be, the name of the great companion, Muawiyah, radiyallahu anhu. So most Arabs would say Muawiyah, and Egyptians would say Muawiyah. So the stress is on the wiyah instead of the ain and the alif. So you have these things everywhere, but in terms of poetry, you only have in Arabic, you only have quantitative meters and not qualitative ones. However, there is some contemporary Nashīds do use this English style, as we'll discuss later, inshallah. So this is it. This is the introduction for part 1. Part 2, let's go into Arabic meters and see how it works. Now, like we said, everything is a combination of certain, those لم أرى على ظهر جبل سمكة. It's a combination of everything. So those of you who have studied Nahw and Sarf will be familiar with actually before that, let's get to what these words are. So things like فعول or مفاعيل مفاعلة فاعلات فاعل. These aren't words that represent things. All they are, they're basically templates to show a particular wazn or a particular template. Yeah, that's all it is. It's a template for words. So those who have studied Nahw and Sarf, and you'll be familiar with things like that, or you'll be familiar with scholars in the tradition using or explaining a wazn by giving its equivalent. So for example, in Nahwa, you might learn about Jam'a, Muntah al-Jumu'ah, and you say mafa'il, like masajid. So mafa'ilu and mafa'ilu, masajidu and mafatihu. So these will become mamnu' min as-sarf. Or you might find something like fawa'il, and in fawa'il you have awamil. So things like that. Those of you who are comfortable with that, then this is the traditional way to do poetry. These awzan, these would represent awzan. So there's 16 bahrs, or the 16 poetic meters that were discovered by, or that were surveyed by the scholars, and they've discovered them. They will be a combination of these 10 scales, you could say. So don't worry about here, you have fa'ilatun as though it's 2 words, and over here you have fa'ilatun as 1 word. Or how here you have mustaf'ilun as 1 word, and mustaf'il with a space and then nun. Even though they sound the same, there's a reason for that, and we're not going to cover this here. So this is just an indication here that there are rules about these things that we're not going to cover, inshallah. Those of you who haven't done that, don't worry about this. So if you haven't done, or if you're not used to using letters as templates, just look at the diagrams. I've created these illustrations as short, long, long. So let's say fa'ulun, I'm going to stretch it to exaggerate it. You say it'll be short, long, long. So fa'ulun. So for example, let's say here mufa'alatun, mufa'alatun, mufa'alatun. So a combination of these in different ways. We have a whole list of all of the meters right at the end as an appendix. So you can check these out later if you want. So for example, let's just go to the examples and then I'll give some more later. So this isn't usually, this bahr is called Mutāqarib. This meter is called Al-Mutāqarib. And it's not usually one of the first ones you learn, but I'm not going to go in the order of how the traditional books learn it, because I'm trying to do it in a more accumulative way, as per the theories of education. So let's say here, fa'ulun, 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 fa'ulun. So short, long, long, short, long, long, short, long, long, short, long, long. That's how it works. So متحرك يليه ساكن يليه ساكن متحرك يليه ساكن يليه ساكن. That's basically how it works. Or حركة سكون. So حركة سكون حركة, and then you have حركة and سكون and حركة and سكون. So you have متحرك, and then متحرك يليه ساكن متحرك يليه ساكن. Then you have another متحرك on its own, and then متحرك يليه ساكن and متحرك يليه ساكن. So don't worry, those of you who might not be familiar with Arabic, don't worry about these. Just notice the application of how it works. So let's say short, long, long. Yeah. So here we have hamza when you call somebody This is short and mutaharrik only. And then you have ya. So ya is a mutaharrik, and the alif is a sakin. or sakina. So you have a mutaharrik and a sakin, which becomes a mad. So yeah. So you have aya or fa'u. It's the same template. So I've stretched this out. Don't worry about how this looks. It looks all strange. I've done it consciously to fit it into the diagrams. Aya sa. Fatha and a sakin. Sorry, a haraka and a sukoon. So aya sa, fa'ulun. That's basically how it works. So we'll do that across the whole wazn, inshallah. So this would basically become one part of the bait. So aya sa, hi hada. So hi is just fa, just one haraka on it. And then ha is a stretch. So although you don't really write an alif, but you generally have a small alif on top of it. So hi ha, the. So hada is long. So hi hada, aya sa hi hada. Then you have the same here, ma, and then qa. Ma qa is fa'u. And then look what happens here. This looks, it might sound a bit tough, but it's not mul. It's just mim has a haraka, and you ignore this alif because, of course, you know, you don't need to read a hamzatul wasl. You go straight onto the lam. So mul. This is why I've put them together here under this blue box. So maqamul is the same as ayasa, and it's the same as hihada, maqamul, and then here muhibbi. So this you'll stretch it, muhibbi. So fa'ulun. You have ayasa, hihada, maqamul, muhibbi. So that's how it works. Short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long. If you want to see the full poem or the full bait even, the أيا صاحي هذا مقام المحب وربع الحبيب فحط الرحالة. So if you want to check out this later, you can by all means come back to this. You will have the slides, or those of you who might be watching it later on, then you can just download it from the website. Everything will be available then, inshallah. So this is one bahr. So you'll find fa'ulun will be one line, and then the next line will be fa'ulun again. One of the popular Nashīds on this, those of you who listen to Nashīds, on this is Muhammad al-Muqit's Da'uni unaji. So Da'uni unaji ya mawlan jalilan idha al-laylu arkha alayya sudula. So he does it according to this. So fa'ulun Da'uni unaji, and then he says mawlan. So I think unajiya or something he does. Da'uni unaji, or just ignore that. Mawlan jalilan. Da'uni fa'ulun ayasa. So it works the same way. Now, just remember this is short, long. The next one we're going to do is short, long. It's just one more long syllable afterwards. This is called Al-Hazaj. So this is fairly common in Arabic, but it's not too common. It's more common, or once you double that, it's actually more common in Urdu. And we're not covering Urdu today, but just those of you who are familiar with Urdu, then you might see this is the most popular one that you're going to find in Urdu. But the reason we're covering it now is because of the next one. So here we've done, it's just short, long. Here's one step further, short, long. And then we'll do a combination afterwards. So here, mafa'ilun. Don't worry about why there's a noon on mafa'il when it's ghayr munsarif. This is not the point. It's just a wasn't here. It's just a template. So short, long, mafa'ilun. So mafa'ilun. So if you look at this one, safahna an. So sa will have the sad has a fatha on it, say it's mutaharrik, and there's no sukoon afterwards. So just sa. And then the fa is mutaharrik, but there's a sukoon afterwards. There's a sakin afterwards. Fah, safah. So short, long. Or na is mutaharrik, yalihi sakin. So safahna, this much would be the same as what we've done, fa'ulun. But safahna an, so this an is the same, and it adds on to the whole diagram. So safahna an, and then the same thing happens here. Ba, short, ba, and then ni is long. So there's a haraka and a sakin. Bani dhuhlin. So dhuh is a haraka yalihi sakin. Sorry, mutaharrik yalihi sakin, and then there's a lin. Now lin is the tanween here is equivalent of a sakin. It's the equivalent of adding a noon here. So dhuhlin is actually bani dhuhlin, short, long. Now here, I've got the full bait here, but I've added another line in as well to show you something. So if you read this, صَفَحْنَا عَنْ بَنِي ذُهْلٍ وَقُلْنَا الْقَوْمُ إِخْوَانُ. Those of you who've studied Diwan al-Hamasa, you'll find this as the second poem. Or those of you who haven't studied it, but you might study in the future, this is what it is. Now if you see صَفَحْنَا عَنْ, this is مَفَاعِلٌ بَنِي ذُهْلٍ again. وَقُلْنَا الْقَوْمُ. So here, nal, you go from the noon straight to the lam. وَقُلْنَا الْقَوْمُ إِخْوَانُ. And the noon, you'll stretch it. If you look into the next one, this is where it gets a bit interesting. عَسَى الْأَيَّا. So مَفَاعِلٌ. عَسَى الْأَيَّا مُؤَن يَرْجِعْ. So مَفَاعِلٌ. So you see the word is obviously يَرْجِعْنَا. So ayyam is obviously plural, and you come with a yarji'na. But you'll see a split here, and you'll see this quite a lot in poetry, where one word is split over two sides of the table. And what this means is this is where the meter actually ends. So asal ayyamu an yarji'na qawman kalladhi kanu. So yarji' is where the mafa'ilun ends, and the na qawman, so the na is actually the start of the next one here, this line square. So na qawman kalladhi kanu. This is how it basically works. So you read it as صَفَحْنَا عَنْ بَنِي ذُهْلٍ وَقُلْنَا الْقَوْمُ إِخْوَانُ عَسَى الْأَيَّامُ أَن يَرْجِعْنَ قَوْمًا كَالَّذِي كَانُوا. The next one, this is the most famous one in Arabic, al-Ṭawīl. So when you see something like min al-Ṭawīl, it doesn't mean, it's min al-shi'r al-Ṭawīl. It doesn't mean it's this is a short passage taken from a longer qasida. What it means is this is the bahr, it's called Ṭawīl because it's quite long. And there are other things as well, like when you see min al-Kamil, it doesn't mean there's a book called al-Kamil, like Ibn Adi's al-Kamil fi al-Du'afa or something. It doesn't mean the qasida has been taken from there. Or like min al-Wafir, it doesn't mean there's a book called al-Wafir and the poem has been taken from there. It just means it's the name of the wazn, and we'll cover those later. So here, fa'ulun, we've done that. So short, long, fa'ulun. And then we've done mafa'ilun as well. Mafa'ilun, short, long. Here is a combination of both of them twice. So fa'ulun, mafa'ilun. So this is how it works. This is called al-Ṭawīl. This is the most common one you're going to get in Arabic. So to give some examples, or an example rather, lisanul. So lam is mutaharrik, and it'll be the short haraka here. So fa, just the fa, li. And the u, lisanul. So the noon goes straight to the lam. Lisanul, space, fata nisfun. So the fa is the short one, everything else is long. Ta nisfun. Lisanul fata nisfun. And then wa is obviously here with the line square. There shouldn't be a space here when you're writing, obviously. I've only put a space here just to make everything fit within the template. Wa nisfun. So fa'ulun, and then fu'aduhu. Short, long. It should be long, according to the mafa'ilun. However, this dal, so fu'a is long, fu short, is long, but the do is short. So this doesn't mean it's a mistake. It's actually not a mistake. This is one of the rules of the particular meter. We're not going to cover those rules. We're only doing, remember, this is just an introduction. We're only doing the templates, not to the exceptions or not the technical rules that come from there. So one of the rules in here is this particular ya, you'll get rid of it. You'll get rid of this ya, generally speaking. Fa'ulun mafa'ilun, fa'ulun mafa'ilu. That's how you'd read it. So lisanul fata nisfun wa nisfun fu'aduhu. Fu'aduhu mafa'ilu. That's basically how it works. But we've kept the whole template here just for the sake of learning the template properly, so you know the usul of it. And obviously, if somebody wants to take it further, then they can. So this is actually from Mu'allaqat Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma, one of the 7 or 10 mu'allaqat that were hung, or supposedly hung on the Kaaba before the advent of Islam. So Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma will be covering the first 6 of his abiyat in part 4, inshallah. So lisanul fata nisfun wa nisfun fu'aduhu fa'ulun mafa'ilu. And then فَلَمْ يَبَقَ إِلَّا صُورَةُ اللَّحْمِ وَالدَّمِ. That's basically what it is. That's the full line. Part 3. So this is the English. Sorry, this is the Arabic. What we've done now. If we go back here, you'll find every bahr would be made up of something to do with these. We've only covered the first two. So let's say you have something like here mutafa'ilun. So short, long, da 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 da. So you have da 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 3 times. Let's say for al-kamil, this will be da 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 da. You'll have that mutafa'ilun. You'll find something like a couple of this often attributed to Abu Talib, the uncle of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he allegedly said, وَلَقَدْ عَلِمْتُ بِأَنَّ دِينَ مُحَمَّدٍ. So وَلَقَدْ عَلِمْتُ بِأَنَّ دِينَ مُحَمَّدٍ مِنْ خَيْرِ أَدْيَانِ الْبَرِيَّةِ دِينًا. And for example, you'll have for al-wafid mufa'alatun fa'ulun. So mufa'alatun fa'ulu. You'll find, for example, وَأَحْسَنَ مِنْكَ لَمْ تَرَ قَطُّ عَيْنِي, which is attributed to Hassan ibn Thabit radiyallahu anhu. وَأَجْمَلَ مِنْ, so مُفَاعَلَةٌ وَأَجْمَلَ مِنْ كَلَمْ تَلِدٍ, so مُفَاعَلَةٌ again, كَلَمْ تَلِدٍ نِسَاءُ فَعُولٌ. The same thing applies everywhere. خُلِقْتَ مُبَرَّأً مِنْ كُلِّ عَيْبٍ تَبَارَكَ رَبُّنَا مِمَّا يَشَاءُ. One of the famous poetry, let's say Qasida Burda, is something everybody's generally familiar with. Again, everything we're covering here is not necessarily an endorsement of everything. Like if we're covering Jahili poetry, it's not an endorsement of Jahiliyyah. And if we're covering specific people's poetry, it doesn't mean it's an endorsement of anything. We're just only covering things that are quite well known or famous just for the sake of ease. So mustaf'ilun fa'ilun. This is al-basit. Mawla yasalli wasallim da'iman abadan. This is basically how everything would work. You'll find a full list of these right at the end, inshallah, as an appendix. But you can practice these in your own time. So like I said, this is something, if you listen to this, passively or on, while going to the gym or running around the park or something, you're not going to be able to take this. You have to watch it actively and practice these as you go on. This is just an introduction, of course. So go back to this, check the slides and practice it yourselves. And then, pick up a book or something and just look at, it doesn't have to be a poetry book, even if it's just any other book. Of course, everything, you want to find a poem somewhere in an Arabic book, whether it's a tafsir book or history book or whatever, you'll find it. So part 3, inshallah, this is quite short. This isn't that hard. We'll do part 3 and then we'll go straight onto the practice, inshallah. So in English, as we said, everything works in line, it works according to stresses, accents, emphasis, whatever you want to call them. So like we said, Japan. So Japan would be dadam. And if we say the other way around, like woman would be damda. The stress at the beginning and then the unstressed is later. So everything works in beats. You'll find in terms of like 4 beats or 5 beats or something. What that means is the stressed syllable. It's not actually counting syllables. Sometimes people want to write something and they count 14 syllables in every line. It's not really going to lead to the conclusion that you want, or you're not going to produce the outcome that you're looking for. So what would happen is you need to do everything in beats. And this can be a combination of various things. I've got all of these jargon on here. You don't need to learn any of these. It's frankly, I'm not sure what language half of these originate from, but you don't need to know any of these. As long as you understand the concept, that's fine. As long as you know the rhythm, is fine, really. So for example, iamb, so you might hear something like iambic pentameter, so Shakespeare's favorite one, or the one that Shakespeare often uses. So you'll find it goes in unstressed and then stressed. So you have dadam. So you'll have dadam, 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 for example. In Muslim poetry, you'll find it. The Prophet with one faithful friend. So really, the way it's supposed to be is you're not supposed to force these meters on. It should just be natural. So if somebody reads that, they'll naturally read it in that way. The Prophet with one faithful friend. The Prophet with one faithful friend. Dadam, 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 dadam. So I've put bold. Every time there's a stress, I've put bold in there just to make it a bit more visually clear. So you don't stress the Prophet with one faithful friend. You don't speak like that. And you don't do it the other way around either, like the Prophet with one faithful friend. You don't speak like that either. It's a bit strange. So if you read that normally, according to English pronunciation, you read it as the Prophet with one faithful friend. Those of you who might be wondering where did I get half of this poetry from, the ones that are Islamic, I've got most of them from here, or some of the examples from here. The Convert's Passion, an anthology of Islamic poetry from late Victorian and Edwardian Britain. So it's edited by Brent D. Singleton. So if you want to see something like this, it's quite good. It's from the 1900s and things. A really interesting collection of poetry. Not all of these are Islamic, by the way. I'll tell you which ones or which one isn't. And yes, and yeah, that's it really. So trochee is the opposite of an iamb. Again, don't worry about these names. You don't need to worry at all. So here what happens is you have a stressed and then an unstressed. So the stressed one comes first. So instead of da-dum, 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 you'll have dum, da-dum, da-dum, da. So as an example, instead of the prof, you'll have hope is. Hope is merely expectation. So instead of the Prophet with one faithful friend, hope is merely expectation. Hope that makes sense. Spondy or spondaic is when you have two stressed ones together. Now, of course, you're not going to have this across the whole poem, so I've added 2 lines here. Generally, you'll have a spondy when it's compound phrases, like you'll say go home, or come back, or something like that. So here you'll have one of the famous ones. This isn't an Islamic one. I couldn't find any examples in here. So this is just from a mainstream poem. Break, break, break on thy cold grey stones, O sea. So of course, the reason I included the second line is to show you're not going to have the whole thing in a really harsh, hammering type of poetry. So these meters, you could tell, it's going to have a completely different effect. So when you say the Prophet with one faithful friend, you know what kind of rhythm, what kind of flow they're going for. And if you hear something like this, break, break, break on thy cold grey stones, O sea, you see, it's got quite a different flow to this. So, but yeah, again, you don't need to worry about these names. So anapaest pronounced in British English. In American English, they take out this A, so anapest. But of course, British English is the real English, so we'll keep it according to that, inshallah. So you'll have unstressed, unstressed, stressed. So this is where you have like 3 syllable words now. So instead of da-dum and dum-da or dum-dum, here you have da-da-dum. So da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-dum. You'll have something like, and a 1, and a 2, and a 3. You'll hear so this one, so iamb, or when it comes to iambs, you'll see something like a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4. Yeah, you'll hear people trying to practice like that. Or anapaest, it'll be and a 1 and a 2, or 1 to the 2 to the 3 to the 4, something like that. They try to practice in these ways. So an example of this would be, and I dreamt of the things that had been. And I dreamt of the things that had been. One of the more popular Nashīds in English was written by Dawood Wonsby Ali, actually, on this meter. Allah Knows, with Zayn Bikha performed it with him. So how does that one go? When you feel all alone in this world. So see, and I dreamt of the things that had been, or da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-dum. When you feel all alone in this world, and there's nobody to count your tears. So it's the same thing that goes on here. This is why he's actually a really good writer, and his Nashīds come out a lot more flowing. All the ups and the downs on that road that you take. So it's got a good flow to it. The opposite of that is dactyl or dactylic. So it's, instead of da-da-dum, you'll have dum-da-da. So stressed, unstressed, unstressed. Dum-da-da, dum-da-da, dum-da-da. You'll have it like that. Just for a handful of silver he left us. Against this isn't a Muslim one. This is taken from somewhere else. I took it from somewhere else. Just for a handful of silver he left us. Yeah. So this is quite a one example you find in normal everyday English speech or idioms. Actions speak louder than words. Actions speak louder than words. This is something that falls within this type of style. Again, the whole point is it should sound as natural as possible. If it sounds forced, or if you have to change something and the word doesn't really fit that way, it's just going to sound cringe. It's going to sound wrong, and it just sounds forced. This is in Arabic what you call takalluf. So you don't want to have takalluf in any of this. So one of the more famous nursery rhymes you'd see on written in dactylic, according to that meter, would be hickory dickory dock, the mouse went up the clock. So you'll find dum da da dum da da dum da da. So that's basically how it works. All proper English poetry, you'll find it'll fit within these 5. So these 5 basically covers everything as far as I'm aware anyway. Again, you don't need to worry about these technical names, as long as you know like da-dum 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 da-dum, or dum da-dum 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 da, and things like that. Just for a note, just for those who are interested in these jargon and the technical names, if you find something like trimeter, it just means 3 feet. A feet is basically there's a combination of stressed and unstressed syllables, but you count it on how many stressed syllables there are. So you can actually mix these together. Like let's say you have an iamb and you have an anapaest as well. You can do that. Like instead of the Prophet with one faithful friend, you could say something like the Prophet came with a faithful friend. So you'll have with a faith. That will be throwing in an anapaest in there. The Prophet came with a faithful friend. It doesn't break the meter at all, because what's mu'tabar here is what you consider is only the stressed syllables. So this is where the beat is. So if you say the Prophet with a faithful friend, or the Prophet with one faithful friend, there's 4 beats. Or if you say here, and I dreamt of the things that had been, it'd be 3 beats, even though technically there's 9 syllables here, and here there's 8 syllables. So you might think the one with 9 syllables is longer than the one with 8 syllables, which is actually, a rookie mistake. The iambic one is actually longer here, and the anapaestic one is shorter. So tetrameter means there's 4 beats or 4 feet. In poetry, you'll call it feet. In music and things, you'll call it beats. So beats are probably something more familiar with. Pentameter is when there's 5, and hexameter is when there's 6, and you can just keep on going. So a combination, you'll have something like Shakespeare's favorite one, iambic pentameter, and we'll look at that we'll look at an example of that later on, inshallah. Not later, as in pretty much soon. Now, one note that's worth considering here is that stresses are important not only for the rhythm of the poetry, but also for the rhyme, for the purpose of rhyme. So rhymes, you might think, rhymes are just words or phrases that have the same, it's got the same sound at the end, which is only half the truth. It is true, it needs the same sound at the end, but you count the same sounds from the final stressed syllable. So if it's not stressed, or if the stresses are in the wrong places, then it's just going to sound wrong. And the reason it sounds wrong is because technically it doesn't rhyme. So this is the theory behind, this is the maths behind it. So mathematically, if it's wrong, then on your ear, it's just going to, somebody who's, native, English speaker, and you'll hear these things, you think, well, just a bit strange. Or if somebody writes, a spoken word like this, or they try to sing a Nasheed like this, you think, oh, this is, it's a little bit cringe. I'll give you an example of that. So stress is a key component to rhyme. So if the stresses at the end of 2 words differ, then they won't be considered to rhyme, even if the final sound is the same. So even if the final vowel is the same, it won't be considered to rhyme. So I'll give you an example of here. These aren't real poetry. These are just sentences I've made up for the sake of this webinar. So let's just say the first line is, I really need to find a pen to borrow. I really need to find a pen to borrow. This is iambic pentameter, Shakespeare style. So I really need to find a pen to borrow. Now you might think borrow, okay, row rhymes with go. So row and go together. So let me see, go, forgo. Okay, this isn't something I can just forgo. Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, I really need the pen. I can't let this go. Yeah, let me do it like this. So you think, I really need to find a pen to borrow. This isn't something I can just forgo. I think this is off. There's something off. And even if you don't know rhythm and rhyme, or even if you don't know prosody, you don't know verse and meter, you might just think, hold on, this just sounds cringe. There's something off here. The jigsaw isn't fitting here. My ears aren't happy. So what you really need to do is change that. You can't have forgo, because borrow is where the stress is. The stress is at the beginning. Borrow and forgo don't rhyme, even though it sounds like the same. The last vowel is the same. The last vowel can be the same. That's not a problem, but the last stress isn't the same. So this is where the problem is. So to fix that, you can do something like this. I really need to find a pen to borrow. I guess I'll have to wait until tomorrow. Now it just flows a lot better. Yes, you might think, okay, this is a good poetry, Yeah, it might not be good poetry, but it is poetry. As in, if you want to, at least this will sound a lot better when you perform it. Whether that's a recital, like a spoken word, or whether you're singing it as a nasheed, it'll just sound a lot better. Now, of course, yeah, you want to have imagery and all these other, metaphors and whatnot in there. Yes, that will up your game and it'll make it a lot better. But if you don't have these in it, it's just going to sound really bad. Even if your lyrics, even if your message is really good, you can say something really, really nice, but you've just said it wrongly, then it's not going to have the same effect. So yeah, this is it. We've done the theory of it, basically. Now, I think what we can do is just go straight into a few examples. So we've covered the theory of the Arabic, or at least the usul of it, the foundations of it, the theory of the English. Now let's look, we'll do a deep dive into a few of these cases, starting with Arabic. So Ahmed Bukhatir has a nasheed, very popular, called Ya Azīman. I didn't write his name here because I'm fairly certain that he didn't write it. Somebody else must have wrote it. Unfortunately, I couldn't locate the author. Otherwise, I would like to give him credit. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward him for this beautiful poetry that is written. I chose this for various reasons, including, it's just one of my favorite poems, you could say. But one important one is it actually helps because there's very few exceptions in this. So remember I said, generally in every poem, you're going to find exceptions, or not exceptions. There's more rules for advanced stages than what we're going to be covering here. So that's the case everywhere. And most poems, you're going to find every line, you're going to find about 2 or 3 cases where it kind of breaks the original template. But here, there's only one case of that. So the whole poem is actually written without any changes, which is why I thought this is a really good one. So what I've done here, I've actually color-coded everything for you, just to spoon-feed it. This was, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward my teacher. I was taught these things by Shaykh Zubayr, not Shakespeare. I'm not saying I'm a student of Shakespeare. Shaykh Zubayr Kola, Hafidhahullah, from Leicester. He's the one who introduced us to the Awzan and Buhur. Now he told me, I consulted him for this. He said, yeah, just try to spoon feed it, even if it, you can spoon feed it as much as you want, but sorry, his point was, just color code everything to make it as easy as possible and just make it easier. So what I've done is I've kept to this same color theme here. So the haraka and the sakin, or the longer syllables would be in royal blue, and then the shorter vowels will be in dark lime. So I've done it in dark lime. So this one is fa'ilatun, fa'ilatun, fa'ilatun. This is how this one works. So long, short, long, 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 short, long, 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 short, long, long. Fa'ilatun, fa'ilatun, fa'ilatun. The whole poem basically works like that. So I'll read some of these slowly, and then we'll probably just speed up towards the end, just inshallah, once you get the hang of it. So of course, like I said, this is not something you can listen to passively, like a podcast or something. This is something you'd want to go back to and practice it yourself, because if you want to gain the malaka, if you want to gain the expertise or the ability to do this, you want to gain a bit of competency, you'll have to be able to actively demonstrate your ability in doing this. It doesn't mean you need to produce poetry. It doesn't mean that, but as long as you can read it correctly, then let's say you're giving a speech and you quote a couplet, you'll be able to say that properly. So here, ashraqat. So ashraqat, ash is a long vowel here, long syllable, and a raqat, ra is short, and then you have qat, which is a mutaharrik yalihi sakin again. So ashraqat naf, this is where it stops actually. I didn't have any breaks in between. It's just, you'll have to be able to figure these things out now. Ashraqat naf, fa'ilatun, ashraqat naf, si binurin. So si is long, and then or fa, and then binurin is ilatun, fa'ilatun, si binurin, min fuadi. So again, fa'ilatun. So you have long, short, long, long. Ashraqat naf, si binurin, min fuadi. I'm reading it in a bit of a strange way, just to exaggerate and get the point across. So this is obviously not how you're going to read it, but I'm just going to emphasize it anyway. Ashraqat naf, نفسي بنور من فؤادي. Practice like this when you can. So حينما رد. حينما رد. Now when there's a shadda, of course, you know there's a sakin and a mutaharrik on top of it. So حينما رد. So فاعلات. Then ددت يا رب. ددت يا رب. حينما رددت يا رب العباد. So أشرقت نفسي بنور من فؤادي حينما رددت يا رب العباد. So the, you're going to stretch this, the عبادي. Also, it's not عبادي as though it's فعول. This is بل عبادي. بل عبادي. So فاعلات. And you'll find this across the board. So going on to the next line, we'll find وانتشتروا. وانتشتروا. فاعلات وانتشتروا. حي وصارد. So حي is fa and then وصارد علات فاعلات حي وصارد. I'm going slow now, but afterwards I'm just going to read the whole thing. وانتشتروا حي وصارد دمع يجري. Again, دمع يجري فاعلات. وانتشتروا حي وصارد دمع يجري. يا إلهي. So فاعلات. يا إلهي خذ بقلبي للرشاد. Say Ameen. Those of you who know Arabic, just say Ameen. يا إلهي خذ بقلبي. So خذ بقلبي فاعلات للرشاد. فاعلات again للرشاد. So this will be وانتشت روحي وصار الدمع يجري يا إلهي خذ بقلبي للرشاد. So if you're going to cite this as poetry, you'd want to say it properly. You'd want to say أشرقت نفسي بنور من فؤادي حينما رددت يا رب العباد. وانتشت روحي وصار الدمع يجري يا إلهي خذ بقلبي للرشاد. Now I'm just going to pick up the pace a little bit, but hopefully you can keep up with it. And if you can't, just revisit this later and practice yourself. You'll have enough of a background to do this now. So في سكون الفاعلات في سكون الليل أدعو في سجودي. في سكون الليل أدعو في سجودي. والدجى حو. والدجى حو لي سواد في سوادي. So والدجى حولي سواد في سوادي. في سكون الليل أدعو في سجودي. والدجى حولي سواد في سوادي. يا رؤوفا. This bit is really easy because it's the same thing over and over. يا رؤوفا. So this يا عظيما فاعلات. يا رؤوفا يا رحيما يا حليما يا كريما ما لفضلك. Now look, fa, this lam li is the ain, right? The short vowel. ما لفضلك. Now of course everybody who knows Arabic will know this should be فضلك. فضلك. But if you do that, it's going to change the wazn here. So what you do is you can keep that as a sukoon for the sake of the poem. يا كريما ما لفضلك من نفادي. And of course, when you listen to this nasheed, go back to this nasheed when you can listen to it, and you'll see the performer actually recites this with a fatha, and what it does is it changes. It's okay. It just sounds okay because the rhythm wise it's still the same, but according to the rules of poetry, technically this will break it. يا سميعا يا مجيبا يا عظيما. Now here اهدني يا. So this ya is the end of the fa'ilatun. Ihdini. So you wouldn't read this as ihdini. So sometimes when you see this, these lyrics written, you'll find a ya in the middle. Ihdini. It's not ihdini. It's ihdini. Like ihdina as-siratal mustaqim. Ihdini ya. Fa'ilatun. Ihdini ya. خالق السبع الشداد. So ya sami'an ya mujiban ya aziman. Ihdini ya خالق السبع الشداد. Again, you can say Ameen. Here we've got the chorus again, so I'm just going to read that. أشرقت نفسي بنور من فؤادي حينما رددت يا رب العباد. وانتشت روحي وصار الدمع يجري يا إلهي خذ بقلبي للرشاد. Again, now the rest of it is du'as again. Beautiful du'as here. للهدى والفاعلات للهدى والحق وفق. فاعلات again. حق وفقني إلهي. للهدى والحق وفقني إلهي. Here I've got the fa in red, so that doesn't mean it's an error. I'm showing you something. So like we said, the first syllable here on every line has been in blue. Yeah, so that means they're all been long. Hi, ya, wad, ya, ih, hi, ya. So this is fa. Fa is actually short. So this is completely fine. You can do that because technically in this bahr you can shorten this one. But again, can you see everything has been fine and there's only this one change that's been made, which is actually quite amazing, because usually in a poem like this you'll find tons of them. Like one famous one would be طلع البدر علينا. So that's pretty much everywhere. طلع البدر. It's not طلع, طلع, but it's actually فاعلات. So طلع البدر علينا. But you know, you have to stretch the ra. من ثنية الوداع. من ثنية. Sorry, ثنية isn't it? ثنيات الوداع. Or it's من ثنية الوداع, something. من ثنيات الوداع. So you'll find this like if you've checked the rest of the poem. ربنا صل عليه. So ربنا صل عليه كلما طاب السماء كلما غرد طير كلما امتد الشعاع. So you'll find that's really nice. So here, yeah, so my point on طلع, so the ta is actually only mutaharrik without a sakin afterwards. So here, this is fine to do, fa'ala, but I'm just going to read it as fa'ala just for the sake of this practice. So fa'alataw fi kalyaw ma'atimadi. So here, look, i'timadi has a hamzatul wasl at the beginning, which means the meme will go straight onto the ain. So ma'atimadi. This is actually the biggest clue that I found from the Nasheed, that Ahmad Bukhatir is not the one who composed this poem, because he actually makes an error when reading it, even though the text is correct. And you find that with many prominent Nasheed artists in various languages, including Urdu, including some of the most famous Nasheed singers. They might have gifted voices, definitely gifted voices. But if you don't learn about meters, then there's something that's always going to be off. This is why the mainstream music industry, you'll see, is booming. And then the Nasheed industry, you hear people saying things like, oh, English Nasheeds are just so cringe, or English Nasheeds are, they're just not that nice. There's a reason for all of that, because it's not done professionally. So those people who are writing these professionally, their Nasheeds are a lot more flowing, and they don't have the cringe to it. So فَعَلَى تَوْفِيقِكَ الْيَوْمَ اعْتِمَادِي. This is how Ahmad Bukhatir should have read it. So according to his tune, the way he did it is he just tried to zoom through it and say فَعَلَى تَوْفِيقِكَ الْيَوْمَ اعْتِمَادِي. This is how he did it. Whereas what he should have done is فَعَلَى تَوْفِيقِكَ الْيَوْمَ اعْتِمَادِي. That would have fit with everything he's doing. So للهدى والحق وفقني إلهي يا إله فاعل توفيقك اليوم اعتمادي يا إله الكون يا عوني وغوثي يا ملاذ الخلق في يوم المعاد ها أنا يا. So أنا, those of you who know, when there's an alif, you obviously don't read the alif, but in poetry you can do that, or you can do waqf on the alif here. So ها أنا يا فاعلات ها أنا يا ربي أرجو منك عفوا فاعف عن ذنبي وحقق لي مرادي فاعف عن ذنبي وحقق لي مرادي. Ameen. So everybody say Ameen. So it's a beautiful dua. The whole qasida is actually a dua. And do you see how he's given all this imagery in here, and he did that with meter and with rhyme. So then this is where the achievement actually is. So this is one example of an Arabic poem, and we're going to come back to an Arabic one later. So here is another short, well, it's actually a long poem by Shaykh Hamza Yusuf called Spring's Gift. I've only taken the first 4 stanzas here, the first 4 paragraphs, you could say, just for the sake of ease, and we'll just go through this quickly. So again, you can find this online. You could just search it, and you'll be able to find a full. You'll find the full lyrics there, and you'll be able to find Shaykh Hamza Yusuf reading it as well on YouTube. Now, here the point is, I've put everything in bold again, just for the sake of ease. And again, I'm not going to analyze everything. I'm just going to read through it. Apart from the first 2 lines, we'll go through. Ayen. So remember, iams. You don't need to know the name, but what happens here is there's an unstressed syllable and then a stressed syllable. So you have ayen. The sand that met his feet. Now here, of course, there's 3 with the sand, and as I said before, even if you throw in a an extra syllable or so, it doesn't matter, because the point or what you consider in English poetry is the stresses only. So it's the beats. So I envy the sand that met his feet. So the vither, you could just skip through it. I envy the sand that met his feet. It'll be exactly the same as here. Look, to save him from his enemies. To save him from his enemies. There's only one syllable each. But here, I envy the sand that met his feet. It sounds exactly the same because it will be the same. So in terms of his beats, this is completely fine. And Hamza Yusuf obviously grew up with his father was an expert in Shakespeare, so of course he grew up and is a very skilled poet. So we'll just go through this in English. I'm just going to read through it, and you'll be able to figure out what's going on anyway. I envy the sand that met his feet. I'm jealous of honey he tasted sweet, of birds that hovered above his head, of spiders who spun their sacred web. To save him from his enemies, I envy clouds formed from the seas that gave him cover from the heat of a sun whose light could not compete. With his whose face did shine so bright that all was clear in blinding night, I envy sightless trees that gazed upon his form completely dazed, not knowing if the sun had risen, but felt themselves in unison. So here, you is actually one beat and ni is another beat. So he pauses there. Oh, you're supposed to pause here. I'm not sure how Hamza Yusuf read it, but felt, selves, uni, it doesn't really fit. But it's unison. He's stressed here to rhyme it with risen, nissen. But felt themselves in you, because you is basically like, let's say Y-O-U, that's one syllable in itself. Not knowing if the sun had risen, but felt themselves in unison. This is okay to do, of course. He's a poet. I'm not going to say if Hamza Yusuf got it right or wrong. Clearly, he got it right. With those who prayed and fasted too, simply because he told them to. And the reason I'm showing you Islamic poetry is to show that it's not cringe. As in, if you know the language properly and you know the maths behind it, and you've got the eloquence to be able to depict this imagery, look at metaphors and create these things, you can articulate yourself in a professional way. So you can't say something like, oh, English is just not a very artistic language. That's a lie, and that's actually insulting, not to us just because we speak English, but because look, all languages are a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We see, واختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم إن في ذلك لآيات للعالمين. So those who know would obviously, the people of knowledge would realize that language is actually a gift of Allah. So we don't need to insult languages just because of our own ignorance of them. Anyway, so this is a short section of a longer poem about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Definitely have a read of that. It's a good example. Here we have a sonnet by Mustafa al-Qabbani. Mustafa al-Qabbani, he's actually been a great help to me. We've been discussing things like this for many, many months actually. And this particular poem is not available in online, or it's not available in the public. It's not been published anywhere. So I've taken permission from him to be able to cover this in full for the webinar, and he's been gracious enough to grant the permission. And just for those of you who are interested, Mustafa al-Qabbani is a professional poet. He's Canadian, and I believe he lives in Jordan now. For one of his Arabic poems, he's actually received an award. So, he's made it mainstream. He has actually honored our request to teach a full course on ʿIlm al-ʿaruḍ, on poetic meters or Arabic meters on the SiblingsOfIlm platform in 5 sessions. So I'm not sure when that's going to happen. Inshallah, the SiblingsOfIlm team will be giving out the details once it's ready. So in his claim, Mustafa al-Qabbani's claim is that in 5 sessions, you can learn everything you need to know. Now remember, I was showing you the fa'ilat and things, and there's, of course, diagrams. I've shown you diagrams as well for 2 different approaches. So Mustafa al-Qabbani's way would be, he'll take the diagram route, and he's not going to go through the, mustaf'ilun fa'ilun, mustaf'ilun fa'ilun. He'll show, short, long, and things like that, with boxes and lines. This is how he's designed it. So it's really good. He's actually got his own matan called Aysar al-Mutun fi ma li shi'ri min funun, or something like that. And he'll be covering that, inshallah. So anyway, his English poetry is brilliant, and it's on an expert level, and we'll go through this. Now, just to tell you what a sonnet is, you might hear of Shakespeare's sonnet. This is why I thought we'll just cover it. So in a sonnet, you generally have 12 lines. So 3 paragraphs, you could say 3 stanzas of 12, and then the last 2 would be separate. So there'll be 14 lines altogether. So what happens in the first paragraph, generally come up with a, you know, with a metaphor or an imagery or something. And the second stanza, in the next 4 lines, lines 4 to 8, you'll basically say, you'll say clearly like what you're trying to get at with that imagery, what you're trying to say. And then from line 9 onwards, the third paragraph or third stanza, just there's a plot twist in there. So generally you see that through but, and then the last 2 will be rhyming couplets. So it's not going to be A, B rhyme anymore. It's just rhyming couplets, and tells you the new conclusion after this thought, basically. That's general structure of a sonnet. Now here, of course, because of the way PowerPoint, you know, there is limitations of PowerPoint, the lines have actually come into, you know, 2 lines and things. But really, it would have been good to have everything on 1 line. So 1 line on a full line. And what we had was 1 box would have been 1 paragraph, and then a space, and then have 4 more lines, and then 2 more lines. I'll go through these now. Bear in mind that Mustafa al-Qabbani is Canadian, so he's not reading this with he hasn't composed this with in a British accent, and I'll explain that when we get to. So here, look at this. This is iambic pentameter, what, you know, Shakespeare used to use a lot, because sonnet is you do it like that. Iams means da-dum, 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 da-dum. Pentameter just means there's 5 beats there, or 5 feet there. I know that death, or God forbid divorce. I know that death, or God forbid divorce, will spell the end of marriage and its bliss. I know that everyone's a future corpse, and health and wealth are often hit or miss. I know that nothing of this world will last. Yeah. Not even parents' love or filial awe. Filial means related to the child, or, you know, parent-child relationship. Their transience, so transience in British, but transience, you have to stress it here. Their transience ensures that hearts stay chaste. In British English, we say chaste, so it doesn't really rhyme with last. And in Canadian, you say the same. However, in an earlier, a more old, an older North American accent, chaste would actually rhyme with last. So you'll say, they'll say last and chaste. So last and chaste would rhyme, and that's how he's basically written this. So those of you who are American or Canadian, you can read it like that. I'm not going to try, because chaste will sound a bit, you know, daft. So I know that nothing of this world will last, not even parents' love or filial awe. The transience ensures that hearts stay chaste. To God, his traits, his actions, and his law. Now there's a twist. But every moment's charged with God through be. Existence is imbued in all affairs. Through hope and fear, the Godhead's all I see. Each glimpse of truth increasing me in prayers. God takes away in order to renew. So this is the point now. God takes away in order to renew. Accept me, Lord, as I've accepted you. Again, say, I mean, this is a beautiful dua. For the final thing we're going to go through before we open up the floor for Q&A is Mu'allaqat Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma. Now, generally, if you've got the Mu'allaqat, and you know, you could go through with a commentary by Zawzani or somebody. The Mu'allaqat generally begin with Imru al-Qais, because Imru al-Qais was by far the most baligh, eloquent poet of all of those. However, people generally advise to go through Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma first, because his one is actually full of wisdoms, it's full of hikam, and scholars actually say that kalamuhu yushbih kalam al-anbiya, so shi'ruhu abiyatuhu tushbih kalam al-anbiya, something like that. That his poetry, his words, the types of wisdoms and points he makes, it resembles the speech of the poets. It resembles the speech of the prophets. So this is the type of wisdoms that he actually got. So this is over 60 baits in the poem. We're not going to do everything, of course. We're only going to do these 6. So Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma. This is Sulma, not Salma. So of course you'll find a lot of poems to do with Salma, and people like to write about Salma a lot. It's actually a pseudonym. Salma is not a real person. They just use that as a, you know, as a name just to keep somebody else anonymous. So this is probably the only time you'll see Sulma ever in your life. So Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma. So most of these Jahili authors weren't like 100 years before Islam or something. They were, you know, in the generation above the Sahaba, so they were kind of around. Some of their children actually accepted Islam, and they were Sahaba. Like I think Bujayr ibn Zuhair or Abdullah ibn Zuhair, or sorry, Ka'b ibn Zuhair, radiyallahu anhu. Ka'b ibn Zuhair is the son of Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma, and there's a few other famous poets as well. Their children were Sahaba. So anyway, the reason we're covering this is, of course, it's a traditional Jahili poem as well, which is really, really important in our tradition. And this is a professional translation by Mustafa al-Qabbani. You can find this for free online. The full book, well, about 10, 12 pages booklet, has been published online by the publishers. So there's no, inshallah, no copyright issues here. He did all 61, I don't know how many it was, 64 verses or something. He rendered all of that professionally in rhyming couplets in iambic pentameter. So this is, I just wanted to show you how proper poetry can be written. So even traditional Arabic poetry, you can render into professional English poetry. Of course, if somebody takes enough time out and just thinks and does it. So here, this is min al-Ṭawīl, and we've covered Ṭawīl before. فعول مفاعيل فعول مفاعل. So أمن أوفى دمنة لم تكلم بحومانة الدراج فالمتثلم. So أمن فعول مأوفى دم مفاعيل نة لم فعول and then تكلمي مفاعيل. أمن أوفى دمنة لم تكلم بحومانة الدراج فالمتثلم. So Awfa is a person, and Humanut al-Darraj is a place, and Mutathallam is a place as well. Don't worry about all of these. There's going to be so many words here that you think, you know, what on earth is going on, because these were normal like 1500 odd years ago, and you know, we don't really have these things anymore. So don't worry about these words. I'm just telling you this just to understand the translation here. So remember, look, lam takallami, he translated as mute. Are these muted remnants? Now remember, dadam 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 is basically iambic pentameter. Are these mute remnants of Awfa's nights, Ad-Darraj Pass and Mutathallam heights? So do you see how he's rendered that into proper English poetry? Diyarun, most of the time you'll find wadarun. So I learned this as wadarun, but here it says diyarun. We'll just read it as it is. Diyarun laha birraqmatayni ka'annaha maraji'u washmin fi nawashiri mi'sami. So diyarun laha birraqmatayni ka'annaha maraji'u washmin fi nawashiri mi'sami. And here's her campsite between two fields much like a wrist tattoo touched up with inky spikes. Do you see how it's rendered that? بها العين والأرآم يمشين خلفة وأطلاؤها ينهضن من كل مجثم. So بها العين والأرآم يمشين خلفة وأطلاؤها ينهضن من كل مجثم. بها العين والأرآم يمشين خلفة وأطلاؤها ينهضن من كل مجثم. Ar'am here is the plural of ritm. Ritm is a female deer, which is an antelope. Here wide-eyed antelope and addax scout successively as calves leap all about. This is quite hard to say because even English is a bit, you know, we're not used to these types of words. Here wide-eyed antelope and addax scout successively as calves leap all about. Here's a bit more of a simpler one. وقفت بها من بعد 20 حجة فلأيا عرفت الدار بعد توهمي. So فعول, you can do that yourself now. وقفت بها من بعد 20 حجة فلأيا عرفت الدار بعد توهمي. I stood before it after 20 years, and with due strain I knew her camp was here. So you see, one sign of good poetry would be just, it should just flow naturally on your tongue. And of course, sometimes that's going to be really tough when you're translating, but sometimes it just flows really well. Like I stood before it after 20 years. It's just so natural. So this like وقفت بها من بعد 20 حجة. He rendered that into English in this way. So some of you might be wondering, how do you translate? And I said we're not going to cover how to translate here, but one thing Mustafa al-Qabbani, the translator here, has actually said to me is, somebody else said to him, what you should do is think, how does that poem make you feel? So if you think, you know, بها العين والأرآم يمشين خلفة وأطلاؤها ينهضن من كل مجثم. how does that make you feel as when you listen to it? Or let's say, go back 1500 years in Jahili times, how would that make you feel? So don't worry about the words for now. How does that make you feel? What feelings, what psychological thoughts do you have? Get that, capture that thought, capture that, and then produce that in your own poetry. So that's basically how he translates. أثافي سفعا في معرس مرجل ونؤيا كجذم الحوض لم يتثلم. Its burnt red rocks where once a cauldron sat, its ditch resembling some preserved old vat. Again, this did this. فلما عرفت الدار قلت لربعها ألا نعم صباحا أيها الربع واسلمي. So فلما عرفت الدار قلت لربعها, most of them would say ألا عم صباحا, ألا عم, but this one says ألا نعم صباحا. We'll just read it as it is. ألا نعم صباحا أيها الربع واسلمي. And when I recognized her camp, I yelled, "Good morning, living quarters, and be well." So this is the translation of how this is the rendition of Mustafa al-Qabbani of Mu'allaqat Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma. And yes, before we end, this is just some suggested readings. So those of you who might be interested, Mizan al-Dhahab fi Sina'ati Shi'r al-Arab. I really like this one. This one is quite recent, as in the author died in 1942, I believe. And there's another one, Nuzhatul Absar fi Awzan al-Ash'ar. I've got this one in front of me here. This is nice as well. But again, they've got the different pros and cons. So if you're coming from, a 21st century, Western background, and you're trying to do all of this, it could be a bit tough. But inshallah, after this introduction, it should be a lot easier. In English, you've got some, missing measures. This basically tells you modern poetry and the revolt against meter. This tells you the history of how and why modern poetry just moved away from meter altogether in a post-truth kind of world. The Encyclopedia of Arabic Literature by Routledge. This is something Mustafa al-Qabbani recommends. There's a 4-page entry on prosody there, page 692 to 622. And this is where basically he's taking it from here to produce his own matan, Aysar al-Mutun. So like I said, there's a mulhaq here, there's an appendix we've got all 16 of the awzan here, Al-Ṭawīl, Al-Madīd, Al-Basīṭ, Al-Wāfir, Al-Kāmil, Al-Hazaj, Al-Rajaz. Rajaz is something that there's actually ikhtilaf among the scholars of whether that's poetry or not. So some would say, no, this is not really poetry. This is just rhythm and rhyme that kids use for for marketing purposes or whatever. It's kind of like they say how in English you have ip dip do, the cat's got the flu, the mother's got the chicken pox, and out goes you, yeah. Or you've got ipidipidation, my operation, how many people in the station. You've got these types of children's rhymes where they use with skipping, Cinderella, dressed in yellow, stuff like that. So mustaf'ilun, mustaf'ilun, mustaf'ilun would basically work in a similar way. That's why a lot of mutun, like hadith matan, the usul al-hadith texts like Bayquniya or something, or some tajweed books and many other manzumas, they use rajas, just typically they use that. And except Shāṭibiyya. Shāṭibiyya is a really interesting one where they did Ṭawīl the whole way. It's pretty interesting. Al-Ramal is, we've covered that again. Al-Sarī', Al-Munsarih, Al-Khafīf, Al-Mudāri', Al-Muqtadab, Al-Mujtath, Al-Mutaqarib, and Al-Mutadarik. Al-Mutadarik here, this one is the one that Imam al-Khalil rahimahullah did not come up with. I don't think either he didn't acknowledge it as poetry or whatever, but his student Al-Akhfash is the one who added this on later. So there's 16 now. We'll open up the floors for Q&A. So those of you who don't have a question, you may leave, or those of you who want to just listen passively, you could just practice these mustaf'ilun, fa'ilun, or look at the diagrams and try to focus. Oh, there was another question actually. Well, my own one. I told you to remind me during the end. Nobody did actually. So if you look at Hamoud al-Khudr's Kun Anta. Kun Anta is a good example of something that sounds nice, but not because it's poetry, not because it's shi'r, because it's not actually on the awzan of poetry. But what he's done is he's used the English stress-based system in Arabic. So how does it go? لِأُجَارِيهِمْ قَلَّتْ تُظَاهِرَ مَا فِيهِمْ فَبَدَوْتُ شَخْصًا آخَرَ كَيْ أَتَفَاخَرَ. So he does it like that. وَظَنَنْتُ أَنَا أَنِّي بِذَلِكَ حُسْتُ غِنَى. Yeah, so he's done it according to the stresses of the language and not in terms of poetry. So that's why his one sounds a bit more like a song. And it probably is because they're they're singers, aren't they? So like the chorus, you could tell in the chorus quite a lot. La 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 نحتاج المال كي نزداد جمالا. Yeah. جوهرنا هنا. So this is basically how it works. Was it the great Khalil ibn Ahmad who demarcated these poetic meters? Yes, it was. Khalil ibn Ahmad al-Basri al-Farahidi, rahimahullah, the teacher of Sibawayh and the teacher of Akhfash. He was the one, he didn't come up with these, of course. These existed before that. So just like, how Nahwa existed at the time of, well, actually, we don't want to say that. Arabic rules and grammar and Arabic in general, the usage was already existing during Jahili poetry time and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's time and everything, but the rules weren't codified until later. So the Arabs obviously spoke naturally, and that was just their language. And in terms of poetry as well, they had a malaka. They just had a knack for it. And once you hear these things around you all the time, you could just do it. So I'm sure there are actually probably musicians or rappers or spoken word artists or whatever. They just write poetry, or they just write things in a rhythm without knowing that it actually fits one of the proper English meters. So so they do these things naturally. Later on, Imam Khalil is the one who basically discovered this, or he realized, and he came up with all of these templates, and he got the rules for it, and his student actually finished them off. Sorry, let me just go up. I think I missed some. There's a lot of comments, so please forgive me. What is the style in Matan Jazariya? How is Shāṭibiyya written? I haven't studied Jazariya or Shāṭibiyya, so I can't comment on it. Shāṭibiyya was shown, I looked at it recently just to see something, and that one's written in Ṭawīl. So I think it's Rahiman wa Rahmanan something. So like fa'ulun mafa'ilun. Jazariya, I'm not sure, but generally, as a rule of thumb, most manzumas would be written in rajas. It's not rajas, so don't say rajas. Rajas. Assalamu alaikum. Session, please could you give the reference of the book you mentioned and where you took parts from? Okay, there's quite a few things I've used over the years. One book that my teacher recommended is Ash-Shafi fi Matn fi Sharh Matn al-Kafi or something. That's the one he used to teach from. I really liked Mizan al-Dhahab, which is actually on the suggested readings list. That one I used to learn it, to take things to a bit more of a higher level. But I don't have the modern version. I have a really old edition. And then this one, Kitab Nusat al-Absar fi Awzan al-Ash'ar. This is quite an older one from the 7th century. For English poetry, Hamza Yusuf one was online. Mustafa al-Qabbani's one he shared with me. And The Convert's Passion, this is something I bought from Amazon. This is pretty good. There's lots of stuff in here. So if you're a Nasheed artist and you want some poetry to sing, just grab this and you can do a lot of Islamic poetry from it. So that's that. What is the relationship between meters and maqamat? I can't answer that. I haven't studied maqamat. Could you point to the free resource by Shaykh al-Qabbani? I can't point to the free resource because I'm not sure if he's published it anywhere. He hasn't actually published it yet. So he's shown me a draft of it, and mashallah, it looks pretty interesting. He will be teaching it himself, inshallah. So I don't know, he might give everybody PDF or whatever. I'm not sure what's going on. So inshallah, those of you who are interested in taking it a bit further, he will do a full 5-session course. I'm not sure, 5 weeks or however that's going to happen. Is the name of the book he held up with poems? Oh yeah, The Convert's Passion. Okay, I've answered that. 2214 Urdu. But is there any book we can use for Arabic poetry but in English? It depends. Do you mean meters or do you mean understanding poetry and things? Because if you do want to understand poetry, then Raymond Farrand has a book called Abundance in the Desert. I think it's called Abundance in the Desert. So he's got some translations of some poetry, and then he explains those poetry, including most of them were Jahili. I think he did his PhD on Jahili poetry, and then he accepted Islam when he looked into the Qur'an and the structures of the Qur'an. Very interesting story. So I've got his book, the English one. It's been translated into Arabic as well as ثروة من البادية. And if you mean prosody, if you mean meters and al-ʿArūḍ, then yes, the Routledge Village Encyclopedia has a section on it. And there's an article as well. If you can access university articles, let me check that person's name again. There's an article you can download from JSTOR if you have institutional login. It's called Identifying the Meters of Arabic Poetry by Ernest Macaras from the University of Michigan. If you can go on JSTOR, you can download that. It should be fine. Is there a recording available? Well, yes, inshallah, it will be available. So it'd be quite ironic I'll be answering this. Jazakallah khair for the Ghalib reference. I was thinking in Hamza Yusuf poem where he says, sun had risen, the had is somewhat sort of ignored to fit with the unison. Sun had risen. It's not ignored. The had is read unstressed. So that's what I mean. The sun had risen. You don't just ignore it. You pronounce it in an unstressed way. So you don't say sun had risen. You say sun had risen. Yeah. So it being ignored to fit with the unison. Could it be that? I don't think it is that at all. But even if it was the case, it doesn't really matter. But I don't think he ignored it at all. Can this class continue? I would love to learn. I would like to learn further now. Well, maybe not with me. With me, let's see what we do, inshallah. But inshallah, you could subscribe to, or you can register for Mustafa Al-Qabbani's course. What is the name of the book by Mustafa Al-Qabbani, please? I think it was called أيسر المتون فيما للشعر من فنون. It's not published yet, and it's only about 8 pages or something. I've seen a PDF of it. It's pretty interesting. What is the link for Mu'allaqat Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma translation, please? I can't give you a link right now, but I think it's RSCCO or something. The Royal Al-Bayt, I forgot what it's called, but it's His Royal Highness Prince Ghazi bin Muhammad. It's their institute, I believe. So you could just Google it. Just Google Zuhair's Hanging Ode, Zuhair's Hanging Ode, and just search Mustafa Al-Qabbani, and you'll find it, inshallah. Yeah, it's not hard to find because the publishers have uploaded it on their own website. Can rules of Nahw and Sarf be broken for the sake of meters, and is there a science behind this? Okay, so rules of Nahw and Sarf can't be broken per se, yeah, but there are khasa'is, there are things that are exclusive rules that apply to poetry, and there are daruriyat as well, or darurat, that sometimes you have to do it, or sometimes you're only doing it just because of the poems. You can't just break rules willy-nilly. It doesn't work like that. There are specific things that you can do for the sake of poetry, and there are some things you have to do in a poem, and those things will be covered in Mustafa Al-Qabbani's sessions, inshallah. So they're called khasa'is and darurat. Very interesting. Can I use inspiration such as metaphor similes from English translation of the Qur'an? Is this plagiarism? Okay, so this is more of a Shari question. The answer to this is you may. Plagiarism, well, not really, as long as, because usually it's pretty obvious where you're taking your inspiration from. But yes, you shouldn't do it in a way. You can only do it as long as it doesn't break adab. So as long as there is no su'ul adab going on. If it's so blatant and you're basically making the whole thing structured around the Quran, and it comes across as, why is this person doing that for it? Then it would be impermissible to do that. So there are cases of this in Arabic as well, where people have taken a phrase from the Quran in their poetry, but done it in a way it's actually quite nice, and it's not against adab or anything. It's really nice. Other people have done it in strange ways where you think, how can somebody do this? So it's quite wrong. Please could you give the reference of the book you mentioned during the session where you took part? Okay, I've done that. There's a private question here. Is it true that Al-Asma'i tried to learn al-'Arūḍ from Al-Khalil but couldn't get it? I'm not sure. Sometimes you hear a lot of funny stories from all of these ancients, and you don't know what's true and what's not. Imam Asma'i was a poet himself, especially if Sawt al-Safir al-Bulbuli is authentically attributed to him. And of course that was in Hazaj as well, فَقَالَ لَا 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 وَقَدْ غَدَى مُهَرْوِلِي, how does it go? فَوَلْوَلَتْ وَوَلْوَلَتْ وَلِي وَلِي يَا وَيْلُلِي. It's a brilliant poem. So he clearly knew it. He clearly knew what he's doing. So whether he learned al-'Arūḍ or not, it becomes redundant afterwards. When there are things dropped from the wazn, do you still pronounce it? Like al-muhibbi was fa'ul and ends with a singular kasra. Okay, stretches and stuff. When it's at the end of something, you will have to pronounce that, because that'll be part of the qafiyah usually. But otherwise, you wouldn't. Like, the fa'ala tawfiqika al-yawma i'timadi. You wouldn't really pronounce it. But you can. I believe you can. But you generally don't. Like وَقَدْ غَدَى مُهَرْوِلِي. You want to say وَقَدْ غَدَى مُهَرْوِلِي. Unless you're learning. If you're learning, I would advise just do it according to the rules, just for the sake of getting used to it and making it natural. And once it's natural, then you can mess around a little bit. صوت صفير البلبل هيج قلب الثميل. إذا لم تستطع شيئا فدعه وجاوزه إلى ما تستطيع. Okay, yeah. I'm in the book which Shaykh showed you in the lesson, the one Victorian poetry. Yes, that was the convert's passion. You can get it on Amazon. I'm just going to read this dua because everyone can say, may Allah elevate you in knowledge and grant you his qurb. Please say again. Is it allowed to compose poetry by mixing the meters, iambic and spondaic? In English, you can. In English, you can, as long as you don't do it in a daft way. Yeah. Spondaic, that you usually can. I'm not sure if you can do drastic ones, but generally, yeah. A lot of meters. If you're gonna do it based on meters, then you should just check them up and see if there's examples of it, and then at least you'll know you won't really be breaking anything. Because sometimes a lot of these meters are actually mixed, or they're a combination of different feet, basically. What was the name of Mustafa Al-Qabani answered that? Could you repeat the title of the book which Shaykh showed us last? You said the title too quick. The Convert's Passion, was it that? The Convert's Passion. An anthology of Islamic poetry from later Victorian and Edwardian Britain. It's probably this one in English, I'm assuming. If not, then it's going to be this one. نزهة الأبصار في أوزان الأشعار by Abu al-Abbas al-'Unnari rahimahullah. So these two are the ones I have in front of me. There's a few more I have on the, there's another one I have on the shelves and stuff. So the other one was a Mizan with Dhahab fi Sina'ati Shi'r al-Arab. If you're going to take it further, I'd recommend you use that one. Unless you use both and you know what you're doing, then you can take bits and bobs from both because they have different pros and cons. Yeah, somebody found the link to Convert's Passion. 1222 fa'udu. Okay, so that's what you mean. Okay, yeah. So how is Qur'an not poetry? It's beyond higher than these meters. Okay, because it doesn't fit the definition of poetry. First of all, it's not written in meter, and it's not written in qafiyah and things. It's not mawzun biwazni ma'adum. It's not on the awzan al-Arab. And if there are sections, if there are passages that happen to fit into a wazn, then again, that's not been written. It's not maqsoodun bihi shi'r, and it's not actually in a full table. You're just going to find a sentence here and there. So remember, I said just because somebody says something that happens to fit in a meter doesn't make it poetry. So things like that. The Qur'an is not poetry because when you read it, it's not going to fit in a table like this. You won't be able to do that. And there's no qafiyah, there's no, I think, even though there's saj'a, there's rhyme in there, definitely, but it doesn't work in the same way at all. Could you not put the next 8 up after Rahman on the slideshow, please? Of course, I'll just do that. These ones are a bit harder, yeah, so don't worry about those. But yeah, you can practice all of those. There's some, like muqtadab and stuff, mudari'. I've written these only in terms of the actual wasn't, but there's rules here that are quite complicated. You can do that yourself. Sure. Is that okay? Let me just go up. Yeah, there's a couple more slides. Yeah, some of these books. Yeah, I've looked at some of these books that are Arabic poetry and stuff like that. I don't really recommend a lot of these books. They're full of waffle. They're full of pages, just filling up the pages for the sake of publishing, and you just get a name to yourself and whatever. I have seen some of these books, and if you want to buy them, what I would recommend is go to a library first, go to a bookshop first, find it there, look at it, or order it to a store and look at it first and see if you find it beneficial. If you find it beneficial, then you could buy it. But don't just buy it for the sake of Amazon reviews or everyone's recommending it and whatnot, because it's just waffle. a lot of the times online articles will probably teach you a lot more than you're going to find through these books. But yeah, if you don't want a book, I'd recommend just go to a bookshop and check them out first, or go to a library and check them out first. Can the email be sent with recommended books and links, please? Possibly, I don't know. Let's see what we do with that. What inspired the movement from poems to poetic meters to free verse, particularly in the West? You can look at that the revolt against meter. I've put a reference in the suggested reading, but of course you'll figure out what it is. Listen, I don't want to get involved in that. Some of you who might have seen my tweets and things, I'm fiercely against so-called free verse poetry. It's not, free verse is not poetry. End of story. That's just. Can you post a link to your poetry, please? No, I won't do that. Can the PDF be shared? PDF of what exactly? If you mean the slides, then yes, you can have. You should have already had them. Those of you who are asking about my poetry, they were available on my website, and I think they're not available anymore. Some of my poetry, just as examples, I've put it on Twitter and things. My English poetry, I haven't done it again. I've probably put a couple of couplets and things, but full poetry, I haven't. What wasn't was that Corona poem on. There was quite a few Corona ones, so I'm not sure which one you're talking about. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes, if you mean that really famous one that went around first, then it wasn't poetry. It was just rhymes. If you mean the really recent one that was on the same, wasn't a sort of Safir al-Bulbuli and the same style, then that would be a Rajas. Do poets typically decide to write upon a bahr or simply compose and then fit it on a bahr? Well, I guess everyone will have their own way. If you're living in Jahili poetry, then you wouldn't know about bahr. You'll just do it based on your malaka. But you can't compose it and then fit it. That's just that's gonna sound cringe and it's just gonna be wrong. Unless no, that's just not going to work. So if you're going to do it now, as in you're not familiar with Buhur and then you want to do it, you should use a Bahr as a template and then do it. And if you need to make any tweaks, just verify whether those tweaks are permissible through these things, or just take an advanced course with Mustafa Al-Qabbani, inshallah, you'll be sorted. Do you always have same Bahr for Sadr and Ajaz of the couplet? Yes, you will. Yes, you will. So the Sadr and Ajaz will be the first line and the second line. The whole qasida has to be in the same bahr. Otherwise, you can't mix and match the buhur within a qasida. So the whole qasida would be in the same bahr and the same qafiya as well. The qafiya will always be the same. So for example, qasida burda will have hundreds of lines in there. Well, I'm not sure I forgot how long it is. The whole thing will be on al-Basit, for example. For those on the journey to learning Arabic, at what stage would you realistically recommend studying al-ʿArūḍ? That completely depends. Yeah, so you could study any time after you're familiar with sarf, basically. After you're familiar with, you're used to switching wazns. Yeah, like sami'un, daribun, yeah, fatihun. As long as you're familiar with that stuff, and you can see, okay, awamilu and mafatihu are very similar, then you could do it. The harakas don't need to be the same, by the way. So you have wazn ishtiqaqi something, wazn sarfi something else, and you've got wazn shi'ri. Wazn shi'ri is a lot more loose, and it's only about the haraka and the sukun. So as long as you've studied a bit of sarf and things, so you're familiar with the language, you can study al-ʿArūḍ. Now, whether it's whether it's a priority at that stage or not, that's a different question. So generally in Darul Ulooms, it's taught around the 4th year or something. So we were introduced to it in our first year, which is just in a lesson Arabic Muallim, and then the teacher just went off on a tangent, a fascinating tangent. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward him. In Tajweed, the letters of Madda is a longer stretch compared to the Mutaharrik with the sakin after. The former sounds longer than the latter, but in the diagrams it's got the same stretch. Is there a reason for this? For example, mafa'ilun, the stretch after the stretch after the fa sounds longer than the end, which is lam and nun sakin. No, it shouldn't be. It should be exactly the same. Mafa'ilun, it should be the same. So yeah, the haraka and the sakin should be the same length. But of course, if you're singing it or something, and if you change the sizes, it doesn't really matter. Ideally, if you're going to do, if you want to do fancy waves and stretch the tune and things, you should do it at the end of the beat and things. So let's say fa'ilatun. So don't do it on fa'ila and then tun fa'ilatun. Don't do that. Just do it on fa'ilatun and just stretch it there. Have a funky wave. Fa'ilatun, have a funky wave there, and then at the end as well. So like fa'ala tawfiqi kal-yawm ma'timadi, something like that. Yeah, it's rapping poetry. It can be, yes. Not necessarily, but it can be. Any books to help and one understand zihafat, khasa'is and al-ʿArūḍ. Any book on awzan al-shi'r, any of them would basically have those. Again, these are the next stages. So yeah, join Mustafa al-Qabbani's course. Get Mizan al-Dhahab or download a PDF or something. Get Nusrat al-Absar or something like that, or just find anything and you basically have it. Did the famous al-Asma'i maintain the Bahr in his Sawt al-Safir al-Bulbul? Yes, he did. Have I missed? Okay, I think we've finished it now. If there are any more questions, then please tell me. But I believe I've reached the end of it. So yeah, alhamdulillah, we're in good time as well. So I'll give it back to Shaykh Hudayfa to say what he wants to say. If anybody's got any more questions, then the chat is still open. Will there be an opportunity to provide feedback? Yes, I hope so, inshallah. So the admins will send you a feedback sheet, and please give the feedback. Everybody's listening, please give the feedback, because I'm trying a different approach in things here. I just wanted to see, your thoughts on it, where we can have areas of improvement and those types of things. So yeah, bismillah, please, your feedback is eagerly anticipated. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enable us to learn these things, not for the sake of mere entertainment and just no benefit, but to actually take benefit from it, whether that's appreciating the Qur'an in a bit more depth, whether that's appreciating the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's integrity, and whether that's or contributing to the world around us by producing English and Arabic literature and whichever languages we're comfortable with, and help give a better name to Islam and Muslims through this. Then may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enable us to act upon righteous deeds. We'll just leave it here. I mean.